It's Ivy Slater, and you're listening to Her Success Story podcast, a show where gutsy businesswomen share their success journey. Hello, and welcome to today's episode of Her Success Story. Today, I have the honor and the pleasure to introduce somebody who's actually a neighbor to me. You know, we're both living in New York City, women on the go. Rita Kakati-Shah is an award-winning corporate and career strategist, mentor, speaker, author, and advisor. She is the founder and CEO of UMA, that's UMA, and you could find all of this information in the notes, ladies and gentlemen. She works with empowering confidence, success, and resilience in women and minorities. Rita has really been hunkered down in the work that she is doing around this, and anybody who has been following her success story knows how important this work is to me. When Rita and I was chatting, and what really drove me to say, hey, you have to come on to Her Success Story, is we got into a conversation around moms. And, you know, sometimes we take a pause from the workforce, and when we're ready to go back, our confidence is not really there. Rita, you're coming with us today, or you're joining us today, just having launched your new book, which is titled The Goddess of Go-Getting. So we have so much to talk about. Let's get started.
Absolutely. Thanks, Ivy, for having me. Hi, everyone.
Wow, my mind's going a mile a minute. Let's take a step back before we just plow forward and say, okay, what is your background a little bit? I didn't share too much. You're a fascinating woman. Share a little bit of your background and then what started driving you to start building this company today.
Amazing. Well, I'm born and brought up in the UK, started my education in the UK, went to King's College London, and my career started off in finance. I was on the equities trading floor as a sales trader at Goldman Sachs, and I stayed there for about 10 years. So that's really how my career started. And just by virtue of being a woman, one of very few on the trading floor, and just being a person of color, I naturally started to get into diversity and inclusion initiatives. And this was in the year 2000, Ivy. So it wasn't a thing back then. It wasn't called DEI or the different headings that we have nowadays. But, you know, that's sort of what I guess planted the seed of just getting involved in sort of, you know, help setting up a women's network and an Asian professionals network. And I've always been a connector and I love people. So that was how it started for me. And then I transitioned a decade later into the pharmaceutical industry. And that was a chance encounter because a family friend approached me saying, Rita, you've got a business background. I'm setting something up with clinical trials and drug development in Delaware. Will you help me? So my question was, what's Delaware? Rather than
what and where?
What, not where, exactly. You know, long story short, that's how I got my feet wet in a completely different industry. So, you know, that's what I was in the pharmaceutical industry. Then I was in business development, meaning I got to travel here, there, everywhere, meeting all sorts of important people who are the decision makers for these new and wonderful pharmaceutical products in CNS, central nervous system. So those travels brought me to New York, which is where I settled and met my now husband, now have 2 kids, a 7 and a 9-year-old, and a pandemic puppy. And exactly, can't forget little Ruffles. And when they were really young, I took a few years to raise them. And I got to tell you, Ivy, and this is something we chatted about before, is that out of all of the jobs I've ever done, by far the most challenging was that full-time motherhood world of mine.
I will say I have run massively successful businesses over the last 30 years. And the hardest job is showing up at 100% in Mommyville.
Oh my gosh. Yes.
And even with my adult children, and then you and I were just chatting about this, even with my adult children, and you know, it's you're always a mom. You know, that you might retire as a CEO, you might sell a business, we could do a lot of things, and we're always a mom.
Forever. Exactly. And, you know, I got into that journey, totally had a different respect for my own mum at that point. And I realized that, wow, this is a 24/7 job. Once you're a mum, to your point, Ivy, you are forever a mum. But there were so many skills that I picked up, and I had no idea of this that I hadn't picked up when I was in the paid workforce. So things like communication, I always thought I'm pretty good at, standing in front of a room full of people or putting together a presentation. But I only realized when I became a mom that I barely scratched the surface. Communication is just as much, if not more important, to be able to have empathy, to listen, to just read the room. I learned that for my kids, my babies at the time, when they can't talk when they're babies, you've got to figure out what they want. My puppy, when you're training a pup, you've got to figure it out. Okay, just telling me what's this, it just tell me what's that. What is it? And it's empathy. It's just trying to observe and communicate through not your traditional channels out there. So it's experiences like this. I thought, gosh, I'm learning so many more skills that would actually enhance my talent should I go back to the paid workforce. And yet I saw there's a big disconnect with this newfound skills that myself and my new best friends, fellow moms had, and the reality of the workforce and how many folks were going to a paid role and what happened. And then you mentioned confidence, Ivy, and that was literally exactly why I focused my company around, because I thought, gosh, what is it? And I realized that confidence was paramount to all of this. I lost my own confidence as well. So
it's, you know what, I think it's so interesting, because what happens, I think, in life in general is whenever we start something new, our confidence is not strong because it's new. We haven't done it before. We have to learn it. We have to acquire sometimes new skills, sometimes just new relationships. So we're not feeling great about that. Yet we put more pressure on ourselves when we stop or pause for motherhood and say, oh, I can't do this. I'm not ready for this. I see it with people starting new businesses or starting a career shift and opening a new business. They're like, well, I haven't done this before. I said, yes, but you've done this, which is, so huge and monumental. And we look at all shifts, challenges our confidence, but we're so, especially as women, hypercritical of ourselves with it.
Yeah. Speaking to your point, there's that famous study, the Harvard Business Review study a few years ago that showed when applying for jobs, women would actually apply for jobs if they checked off 100% of boxes, whereas men would literally check off 60% and still apply and get those jobs. So a lot of it is confidence. A lot of it is by virtue of being women. Research shows we are more perfectionist by nature. And that's why we put more pressure on ourselves. So it's just really, really things like that. It's a whole big ball game. But I think ultimately, it comes from within. That self-belief, that self-awareness, that whether you feel good about going out, that comes from within. So, I remember examples, Ivy, of when I was a new mom. And my husband would say sometimes, hey, let's go on date night. And I've got some colleagues coming out and, they're bringing spouses, let's go out. And at this point, I would think of any excuse not to go out. My kids, I sleep train them both really early on, but I would think of bogus things. I would be like, oh, they may get up in 12 hours, therefore maybe I should stay behind, whatever it was. But ultimately, I thought, what if somebody asks me, what do I do? Are you just a mom? What else do you do? Things like that. Now, if someone asked me that, I would blast their ear off about, oh my gosh, I'm doing this. That. Well, what else did you do? Oh, is that it? So, but I didn't have that confidence back then. I doubted who I was. I fully didn't even realize this powerful position I was in until afterwards. So ultimately, the confidence comes from within, and we are the only ones that can bring that out. You can read magazines, you can read books, whatnot, but ultimately it's our self-belief that needs to kick in. And that's one of the reasons I really, really focus my work around the confidence aspect.
So tell me a little bit, let's look at the book a little bit, The Goddess of Go-Getting. And I think first of all, having written a book, any person who sits down to write a book is a hero in my eyes. I think it could be one of the hardest things. And talk about lack of confidence. I swore I would never write a book because writing is not my forte. I don't feel good about my writing. I have to have like 8 people proof my writing. I'm like, oh, this is not for me. I'm never going to do it. I'm just going to, I'm good without it. My company's going to be fine. I'm going to be fine. I could just pass this over. And I realized if I let my lack of confidence stop me, that wasn't the role model I wanted to be, not for all my clients or anything else, but for my kids.
Exactly. Totally. And I would like literally copy and paste everything you just said. For me, it was hard. It took me over 2 years to write this thing. But I had to keep going back to when I had those moments of, oh my gosh, what am I doing? Who's going to read this? It's like, well, what's the reason for doing this? I had a message to get out there. It was an empowerment message, an empowerment journey. And it was really an amalgamation of my professional, my personal experiences, which shaped who I was and decisions that I made after that. And I thought I had to get this message out there because there were so many sort of pearls of wisdom, so to speak, that I hope folks that have read it and will read it find. But one of the reasons it took me so long, because I wasn't great at writing either. I can write an article here and there. I can edit beautifully. I can write short things here and there, but an entire book, like 50,000 plus words, and then you have to put them into chapters and think, oh gosh, what am I going to put where? Does it still flow? It sounds good to me. Is it going to mean anything to somebody else? These are all real decisions. And eventually I started writing in a prose, and the final version, because there were so many different versions that I started with, is a very simple version. I thought if I was reading it to my kids, if my son, he's now 9, but I don't know, when he turns 10, could potentially pick up and understand and think, aha, oh, I understand that. And the way I did that was when I speak in a certain way that I try to resonate with my audience and create those moments. So the way I ended up writing was sort of speaking it out and almost transcribing what I was saying and then editing that version. That made my life a lot easier. And my chapters were according to how I do my trainings and talks. So that's how I eventually did it, because I thought, how do I do this? What do I do? I'm taking the risk, but how, what, where, when, and there's so much literature out there on how you should do this and what you should do there and write like this, write like that. At the end of the day, I just wrote, and it's my own style. It's not following my English literature classes, which I excelled at school. None of that. I didn't use any of that. Came from the heart. It was a story coming out in the end that I was telling.
It's interesting because I did the same thing. Yeah, for my book. It's my first book. I literally, this was back in the day. It came out in 2014. So it's the time. It was no Zoom, no right. But I went on to freeconferencecall.com and I started recording. And I would walk in my bedroom, and I would just record, and then I would just say, okay, now how do we transcribe this? What's a transcription service? How do we, and then I sat on my daughter's floor when she went to college and printed out everything and cut and pasted into piles.
Oh, wow.
I'm visual, that's right. That's my thing. So tell us a little bit about the book. So I love that it's an easy thing to pick up, because I think there's a lot of books out there. There's a lot of content out there, and where technology and the way technology is advancing, our attention spans are shorter and shorter. So when we can capture things simply and easily matters.
Yeah, and that was my aim. I thought, if I'm getting a message out there, who is the message for? Yes, it's called the Goddess of Go-Getting. So there's a huge empowerment element to that, of confidence and communication and different sort of nuggets that I've picked up along the way. But it's equally a book about culture, about inclusion, about workplace success, about leadership. A big part about just how to be a decent leader. I talk about the decency quotient and different ideas like that, because it was supposed to be a book that anyone can pick up. So I redefine things. So for example, when you think typically of just the word minority, you think of ethnic minority, you think of just different backgrounds that you might come from. For me, I want some that proverbial white manager to pick it up and think, aha, I get this, and I felt like that too. So I redefine minority as the dictionary version. If you are in the lesser of a certain, population, you are the minority. And everyone's been in that situation. You could have been the only vegetarian in a room full of meat eaters, or you could have walked into a religious function and you're the only non-orthodox person there, or whatever it is. There's always some situations even for a moment we thought, gosh, that out of place, having to kind of like kick into like, okay, how do I get out of this? How do I navigate it? Do I talk to people? Do I not? What do I do? And we've all had that. So things like that and the real life experiences of what we've all had is what I sort of really blend into each of my personal anecdotes, which really shapes my examples of the professional element to kind of almost make it come to life. I didn't want to just write a textbook. You can just Google that. You can Google this and that. I'm like, no, to make sense, to understand what it means to feel that sense of inclusion, to feel that sense of belonging. I use my own personal examples when I first moved to the States, when I started my first job, when I was at school, when I went here, and all sorts of examples throughout the book, which I hope, brings it to life a lot more.
And I love what you're saying is this sense of being the minority. And we're all minorities at different times in different circumstances.
Yeah.
And it's, even if we look at our kids, it's, if everybody's wearing one brand sneaker and you're wearing a different brand sneaker,
yeah.
How does that feel? If you feel that everybody is good in math and you're not good in math.
Yeah.
And I think that is so enlightening. It's so simple, yet so enlightening, because we forget what it truly means.
Yeah.
And how we all have been uncomfortable or felt we didn't belong at some time.
Absolutely. Yeah, exactly. And then, mixed with that, the whole sort of environmental, cultural differences that play a huge part in that. Quite often when we think of just phrases like diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, all the zillions of phrases that are out there these days, quite often you think of one area, like in the US or on the East Coast or here or in the UK or wherever, but you think, actually, if you look at different parts of the world, you look at these big cities, but these big cities are basically transplants or immigrants coming from different parts of the world. So in a way, not opening yourself up to how things are done differently, what are accepted norms elsewhere, doesn't mean that person is doing something wrong over here. They just come from a different background.
Right.
And that level of understanding and knowledge can really make a difference. And wanting to find out and hear about these things can make such a big, big difference as well.
So before we close, I want to ask you one last question. What is one thing we can all do, something simple and actionable, that we can all do to raise our level of confidence within ourselves?
I love that question. One thing I do talk about in the book, and I actually do trainings on this too, is the differences and understanding the differences between empowerment and entitlement. One of the differences I would say in both of them, you have that confidence, you use your voice, but the difference with the empowerment part is you listen and you have empathy first. So my sort of short response to your question, Ivy, is that take the time to listen to others before you go out there with your response, because that will actually make you more empowered and make you more confident as a result.
I love that. And I love that when you say take the time to listen, the first thing that came to my mind is like, take a breath before you respond.
Exactly.
I love it. Rita, how can our listeners learn more about you, follow you, grab the book? All of the above.
All of the above. So my company, Uma, our handle is at Be Bold, Be Uma. We're on Twitter, we're on Instagram, we're on LinkedIn, we're on Facebook. I'm on LinkedIn too, personally. My own Instagram is Rita.Kakati. I'm on Facebook as well, and my personal website is ritakakati-shah.com. So those are some ways that folks can get hold of me. And the book, that's available at bookstores all over the world, I'm told. Amazon is usually a good spot that people try to go to get themselves an online copy.
Excellent. And listeners, what I will always say at this point, take a moment, take that breath, and think about, from listening today, what resonated with you? What was the piece that you took away, something, that aha moment? Take a moment, put that in the show notes, and think about what action you're going to take forward for yourself from that. Thank you for joining us here today. If this episode resonated with you, share that forward with a friend and feel free to subscribe. We come into your wonderful podcast apps every Monday morning. See you next time. Rita, thank you so much.
Thank you, Ivy.